Welcome everyone to our podcast for this week. Today we're diving into a chapter called The Double Helix, Aboriginal People and Sport Policy in Canada, written by Janice Forsyth and Victoria Paraschak. I'm Ben.
I'm Bosco.
I'm Michael.
I'm Stefan.
And I'm Shardul.
This chapter is a large one. It's heavy in policy, but it's also deeply political and personal. And we're going to try to break it down and make sure that everybody understands it.
I'll say it up front. When I first read this, I thought it would be a dry policy overview. It's not. It's actually a critical unpacking of why good intentions in the government don't always translate into meaningful change for Indigenous communities.
Right. And the history piece really sets the tone. This isn't just about a policy released in 2005. The groundwork for understanding it goes back decades to the 1970s, the native sport and the recreation program, the Northern Games, and the ongoing tension over what sport even means.
Yeah, and for me, the part that hit the hardest was the community piece, the way that funding got routed around Aboriginal sports bodies and into mainstream organizations instead. That's not a small administrative detail. That's a political choice that reinforces inequity.
Exactly. And theoretically, this chapter is doing something really interesting. It's borrowing the double helix from biology and it's pairing it with the Giddens theory of structuralization to explain both the separatedness and the connection of the indigenous and the mainstream sports systems.
Yeah, I agree. So let's get more into the theoretical framework and we'll talk about the historical background and the objectives of this policy. Let's take a look at the theoretical framework now.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with the double helix itself. Forsyth and Paraschak, they borrow the image from biology, like the DNA double helix. The two strands are running parallel and they're connected by crosslinks. They use it to represent the mainstream media and the indigenous sports systems in Canada. The two strands run independently but connect at certain points.
Yeah, I found that very interesting as well because all the biology courses we've been taking, and it's a cool spin on showing the organic connectiveness of sport within our society as a whole. Um, Alex Nelson, who was a key figure in Indigenous sport movement, actually used this model during the policymaking process to explain the relationship to a federal representatives.
Exactly, right? So it wasn't invented in a university. It emerged from within the movement itself. The authors use it because it does three very useful things. First, it provides a common, accessible image that allows people to have complicated conversations about philosophical differences. One concrete example: Indigenous people, they use sport as a tool for self determination, for mainly cultural identity, governing themselves, passing on traditions. That's a fundamentally different purpose than how the federal government thinks about sport.
Second, the model positions the Indigenous sport system as a separate and equally legitimate system, not as a deficit version of the mainstream, but its own valid entity that deserves government resources. And the authors also show how authorities in the mainstream repeatedly challenged and rejected that framing.
The third function of the model is showing movement, showing that the two systems influence each other, even within an unequal power structure. That's the crosslinks.
Yeah, and what's striking is that even though the double helix model was central to how Aboriginal sport leaders framed their entire policy conversation, the final policy document refused to fully embrace it. So, an early draft actually included languages about parallel Aboriginal sports systems, but as the document moved up through governments and officials, they just removed it. And one participant in the latest study quoted that in the chapter directly that people were becoming very uncomfortable with the idea.
Right. And that says something important about power. Right? The framing that indigenous stakeholders brought to the table was useful enough to use in conversations, but it was threatening enough to remove from official documentations. But now let's layer in Giddens. Forsyth and Parasite, Forsyth and Paraschak, they use this concept of duality of structure to explain how individuals and groups, indigenous peoples in this case, navigate and shape systems around them. Giddens argued that social structures both enable and constrain action. Agents aren't fully free, but they're not fully determined either. Does that make sense?
Yep, and there's actually a distinction here. Giddens says people don't always have to consciously articulate how they're navigating a system. A lot of it comes from what he calls practical consciousness, knowledge embedded in lived experiences.
So when Indigenous sports leaders pushed back against the NSRP being canceled in the 80s or created the Northern Games in the 70s, as a counter to being excluded from the Arctic Winter Games, those weren't just reactive moments. They were agents working within the limits of what they believed was possible and shaping the system as they went.
Yeah, and this connects to the author's argument that sports itself is a socially constructed practice. It's not neutral ground. However, whoever gets to define sports and like what counts as sports for really, what gets funded and what is really legitimate is who has power. And historically, federal officials have defined sports in ways that serve their institutional priorities, not Aboriginal communities' visions.
Yeah, that's actually such a good point. The authors quote Richard Greno's work on this. The people who make the rules get to legitimize their preferred forms of sport. And over time, those forms become naturalized. They come to seem like the only way sport could be. Policies crystallize and accelerate that process.
Yeah, I think that the Aboriginal sport policy definitely has some ambitions, but it's also it needs a lot of work.
Yeah, that's true.
Absolutely.
Sorry, go for it, Mike.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So now let's transition to the historical context. The Aboriginal port sport policy released in 2005 didn't emerge from nowhere. Let me walk through the key moments that made it possible. It starts with the Native Sport and Recreation Program, the NSRP, which was established in 1972. This was the federal government's first dedicated effort to support Indigenous sport and recreation on and between reserves. For almost 10 years, it worked, producing basketball tournaments, hockey, rodeo, Métis days, and even Indian summer games.
Yeah, but there was always tension. The federal sports body kept pushing for a vision of sport that aligned with its mandates, high performance and competitive athletes and competition. And Aboriginal organizers had a broader, more cultural, grounded vision for sports.
Hey guys, just a disclaimer, my internet is kind of bad, so for the remainder of the podcast, I'll just be not without my camera for now. So I'll just start from where we left off. So basically, that tension came to a head in 1978 when fitness and amateur sport wrote to the Northern Games Association and said that their traditional activities didn't fit with the department's sport mandate. And then in 1981, the NSRP was shut down entirely when federal priorities shifted to elite sport. The rationale? The activities it supported weren't going to produce high performance athletes.
And yeah, that's a stark illustration of structural power. And to note, this wasn't actually accidental. It was a deliberate institutional choice that privileged one version of sport over another.
Then, in 1990, the two things happened. The Ben Johnson doping scandal prompted the Dubain report, which called for sport to be evaluated on ethical principles, including for undeserved groups, not just medal counts. And the inaugural North American Indigenous Games were held in Edmonton, becoming what the authors call a cornerstone of the emerging Aboriginal sports system.
The federal sport, the way ahead report in 1992, it recommended a national indigenous sport body. And then in 1995, the Aboriginal Sport Circle, the ASC, was created and federally funded. Provincial and territorial Aboriginal sport bodies, the PTASBs, they began forming too.
Yeah, so by the time the 2002 Canadian sport policy was actually released, it committed all 13 governments to a value-based approach, including access and equity. There was already a growing Indigenous sport infrastructure that needed formal policy recognition.
And in 2002, the ministers formally declared support for an Indigenous sport policy. 3 years of negotiations followed. The policy was released in 2005.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the objectives and structural limitations. Now, for the policy itself, Forsyth and Paraschak are clear that this was a significant milestone, the first policy of its kind anywhere in the world. Even Australia, which had invested heavily in the Indigenous sports programs, had no comparable national policy document.
Yeah, and the authors are deeply critical. The first major issue is structural, and this is a department policy, meaning that it lives within Sports Canada and which sits within Canadian heritage, and it limits what we could actually do.
So, Indigenous sport is connected to health outcomes, justice, education, suicide prevention, diabetes, issues that basically require a whole of government approach. But as a departmental policy, the Indigenous sport policy can acknowledge those connections, but not formally address them. It can't create horizontal relationships across Canada uh, and Northern affairs, justice, and so on.
Yeah, the authors say that if it had been a federal policy rather than a departmental one, it could have institutionalized those cross-departmental connections. Instead, Sport Canada officials they hoped those relationships would form informally, but hope isn't policy at the end of the day.
In terms of the actual objectives, the policy doesn't set specific measurable goals for the Indigenous individuals. Instead, it outlines four broad areas: enhanced excellence, elite sport access, enhanced participation, enhanced capacity, building human resources, and enhanced interaction, which is collaboration between governments and Indigenous organizations.
Yeah, and these are tied to Canadian sport policies framework, meaning the Indigenous policy is structured as an add-on to mainstream sport development, rather than a distinct vision developed with Indigenous communities and their elders and or knowledge keepers. The authors actually see this as a missed opportunity.
Okay, let's talk about money. The Because the policy came with a $12 million federal commitment over the span of 5 years from 2005 to 2010, which sounds significant. And in the context, it was the largest federal investment ever in Aboriginal sports. But when you trace to where the money actually went, a bigger picture emerges.
Yeah, so there was actually four areas that were funded: NAIG hosting, athlete travel to NAIG, provincial and territory sport development bilateral agreements, and increased ASC funding.
And on NAIG hosting, up to 3.5 million was made available. But the authors note that this funding framework actually predated the policy by 2 years. So it's debatable whether it was really a product of the policy or just an institutionalized by it.
Very interesting. Yeah, and the athlete travel funding up to $1 million was genuinely new and meaningful. The authors were clear about this. Indigenous athletes, especially those from rural and remote communities, face enormous financial barriers. About 75% of the Indigenous population lives outside major urban centers. In some cases, getting to a competition requires an airplane ticket just to reach a town that sells sports equipment.
Exactly. The regional consultation report has a striking example from Ontario. Indigenous people in isolated communities, they can't drive to a sporting goods store. An airplane ticket to reach the nearest supplier is already a cost. That's the daily reality shaping sport participation.
Yeah, and then there's a bilateral agreement funding, the money directed to provincial and territorial governments for Aboriginal deployment. development. Here's the core critique. The money went to Aboriginal regional governments, not to the provincial territorial Aboriginal sports bodies who are actually rooted in Aboriginal communities and their understanding of needs. And that matters because it means Indigenous communities often have the least control over programs that support them.
I agree. Yeah, in some regions, money ended up in a well-established mainstream sport and recreational organizations. So the funding was supposed to support the Indigenous sports system, but in practice, it was actually reinforcing the mainstream system's involvement in Indigenous communities, which is actually the polar opposite of what supports the double helix.
Yeah, and the ASC chair, Lyle Daniels, said that directly at the 2005 Ministers' Conference, he commended some governments who made Aboriginal sports development a priority, but called out that others had chosen a very different route. That's a polite way of saying that the money wasn't flowing where it was supposed to.
Very good point. Very good point. All right, let's move on and talk about, yeah, the missing action plan. The single biggest structural failure the authors identify is this. The Indigenous sport policy promised an action plan. It's written right on the document, but it was never publicly released. Not then, and not by the time that this was written.
Yeah, and this matters enormously because without an action plan, there are no specific objectives. Without specific objectives, there's no way to evaluate whether the policy is working. And again, without evaluation, there's no accountability. The authors describe this as making transparency and accountability impossible.
Yeah, that's really interesting when you compare it to the likes of the other Sport Canada equity policies. The policy for persons with a disability has an action plan. Policy for women and girls has an action plan, and it's a clear resource commitments for 2009 to 2012, but there's no commitment for the Aboriginal sport policy.
Yeah, the authors argued this, and it's not accidental. Most provincial and territorial governments believed Aboriginal sports could just be fooled into adopting the generic Canadian sports policy, and that no Aboriginal specific objectives are needed. The absence of an action plan institutionalized this assumption.
There's also a report that's relevant here. Best Practices Physical Activity Programs for Aboriginal Youth, completed in 2007. It compiled insights from people working in Indigenous sport and recreation development across the country, and the government shelved it almost immediately. The authors suggest the data, which showed Indigenous communities wanted sport as a tool for broader social development, not elite competition, ran counter to the government's institutionalized definition of sport.
Yeah, I just wanted to say we want to spend a few more time on the critical implications, and the chapter was written in the context of the 2012 Canadian sport policy renewal, which explicitly states the government will respect the existing roles and responsibilities and only encourage new partnerships. What does that signal about the future of Indigenous sport policy as a whole to you guys?
Yeah, I could add. So, encouraging relationships between departments without dismantling administrative silos is not structural change, it's optics to appear more ethical. And it places the burden of advocacy back on Aboriginal sports organizations who already have a limited capacity. And I wanted to add, so even policies framed around reconciliation can still reproduce the same colonial power structures if the decision-making power never actually shifts.
That's a great point, Stefan. And I honestly just want to bring up the residential school reference in the constellation data. Yukon respondents talked about billeting as a barrier because some parents were trauma survivors of residential schools and shouldn't be put in the position of hosting young people. I mean, that's an issue far beyond Sport Canada's mandate, but it honestly directly ties in and shapes who can participate in sport. A department policy cannot even touch that.
That's exactly right. And that's kind of Forsyth and Paraschak's point about the limits of the departmental approach. The authors say the issues they heard in consultations were, quote, almost certainly going well beyond the social policy objectives imagined by Sport Canada officials. The policy doesn't have the scope to address these realities.
Yeah. I think the most analytically interesting tension in the chapter is this. The indigenous sports system has been actively built over 50 years. The Northern Games, the NAIG, the ASC, the PTSBs, the coaching programs. This is real. It's a real functioning system. And the 2003 draft of the policy actually included a line saying there is no desire to create a distinct sports system for Aboriginal people. Don't you think that's a remarkable eraser of a system that already existed?
Yeah, that's a great point. It reveals whose knowledge counts in policy. And the double helix developed by Indigenous practitioners was useful as a conversational tool, but it was too threatening to be put into writing. The best practices report developed from a ground level, Indigenous experiences were shelved. That's not a coincidence.
And yet the authors didn't end in total despair. They note the policy does formally recognize the Indigenous sports system in its guiding principles. It does acknowledge a holistic approach to sport. It does direct some resources towards Indigenous organizations and athletes. The question is whether that's enough. And the answer, they argue, it's clearly not.
Yeah, so the author's version of enough goes down to two things. The first being creating structural links between federal departments so that sport, health, education, and justice can work intertwined and can build up Indigenous well-being. The second being that it needs to feel central to generate an action plan with Indigenous peoples, and that it can direct resources to communities and builds capacity within the Indigenous sport bodies, which would advance self-determination.
Yeah, and you notice how that second recommendation loops back to the double helix? The indigenous sports system doesn't just benefit indigenous communities, it has something to offer to the mainstream system as well. The model works both ways, but the indigenous system needs to be further legitimized before those contributions can be recognized and adopted.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so Forsyth and Paraschak, they give us this chapter, and it's like a theoretical intervention, a policy analysis, and a personal account. Their core argument being the 2005 Indigenous sport policy is a genuine milestone, and it's the first of its kind, but it is limited, and there's a lot of drop-offs that could be better implemented. It's a departmental policy. It was unable to address the full complexity of Indigenous well-being. The promised action plan was never released. Funding was bypassed, and sport bodies went to mainstream organizations for recommendations. And the government's definition of sport consistently collided with the Indigenous community's broader, holistic views.
Yeah, just building off what Ben said, what the double helix model gives us is a framework for insisting that Indigenous sport is its own legitimate system, not a deficit version of Main Street sport. And that deserves support on its own terms.
Yes, and the historical context makes clear this has been a consistent struggle. From the NSRP's termination in 1981 to the Northern Games being defunded completely to the best practices report being shelved.
Yeah, and this pattern is Aboriginal communities and organizers build something meaningful, close to home, close to community, and federal institutions engage with it when it's useful for them and withdraw when it challenges their priorities.
Yeah, I totally agree. Until the indigenous sports system is structurally legitimized through an action plan, direct funding to the PTSBs, cross-departmental policies, the double helix will remain unbalanced. One strand will keep growing stronger than the other.
All right. So does anybody have any final thoughts or ideas?
No, I think I'm good from my side.
All right.
Good.
Final thoughts from me.
Sorry. With that, we'd like to thank you all for listening, and we will see you guys in class. Be sure to check the discussion board, and yeah, have a great day.